And we're back. You're listening to Gadfly Radio with Martha Montelongo, Ben Boychuk, that's me, and John Seiler. And we're talking to Jim Manzi about his new book, Uncontrolled. And before the break, Jim, you made reference to some education reforms. I want to talk about that because that's a section at the end of the book where you make certain policy recommendations. You talk about deregulating K-12 education in the United States. You're very big on charters. Tell us a bit about that, and in particular, what I'm kind of wondering is why should we continue funding institutions and bureaucracies? Why not just hand over money to kids and let parents choose where they send their kids to school, whether it's private or parochial or a really good public.
Yeah, we don't actually want to give it to the kids.
Right, we want to give it to the parents.
I know what my kid would do with it.
Yeah, right. Mine too.
Right.
Good.
Well, I think that my take on this doesn't really please either side in the debate that much because one of the things I go through in the book, as you reference, is really looking at all of the randomized experiments that have been done in assigning kids to charter schools, to voucher schools, which is, say, private schools funded with public vouchers, and magnet schools, and observe that, on one hand, you do see this is one of the few things where you can actually see replicated across multiple really pretty good experiments that you get improvement in test scores and other outcomes caused by the ability of students to move around between schools.
Right.
The flip side of it is that improvement's actually pretty small. It's like there are a few percentiles better than they would be otherwise on standardized tests. Now, I think that if you had a more complete market, you probably would get further improvement, but that remains a theory. The second thing I say when I move to recommendations is if you think about actually doing what you just described, and I in the past have really kind of pounded the table for vouchers for exactly this reason, if you think through the practicalities of what you described, just like we were sort of laughing about, we wouldn't let our kids assign the money, we would almost certainly have some guidance or limitations on what schools you could use the voucher for. Like suppose someone set up a school and they gave parent incentive payments, which are equal to the tuition minus $1. Right? We would say, no, you can't do that. That's illegal. Or I wanted to set up a bomb-making school. You'd say, no, you can't do that.
Right.
And so then you'd have to have, of course, some enforcement of that. And you'd have to have some kind of adjudication of parents saying, well, no, this is unfair that you're saying this school is classified as I can't do it, et cetera. So at that point, if I have them so-called private schools,
but we have that with colleges, right? We have that with universities. I mean, in universities I think the financial aid at the university level is way overboard. I mean, the financing, the guaranteed financing has, I think, caused for a ballooning of tuition costs because professors get their raises as sure as the sun comes up in the morning.
Administrators
and even though despite whatever's going on in the economy at large, I mean, the government shouldn't be in the business of handing out those loans. So how do you do it with vouchers so that you don't cause that kind of inflation on, tuition costs, for private schools as well? But there are there's certification standards that go into what is a university.
Right. And I think when you're dealing with, 5 to 17-year-old kids, those standards are going to be a lot more strict than when you're dealing with adult to semi-adult college students. And I also think we are seeing, inevitably, all third-party payer systems will create the kind of cost ballooning problems we see in universities. And on a very long fuse, I think we're seeing the kind of reaction I talk about in the book that inevitably occurs when people paying the bills finally say, look, this is ridiculous. You can't take my money and transfer it to people but not allow me to control how it's spent and simply wave your hands and say, well, it's tenure or it's academic freedom or it's universities just decide what their cost structure is going to be. I think we're actually seeing that bubble popping right now. And it can take a while to happen in a democratic process, but eventually the people paying the bills will demand and should have authority over how that money gets spent.
John, do you want to jump in here?
What about the ultimate change here or random thing? Why not just get rid of the government entirely? Get rid of truth.
No, I'm laughing, John. Of course. I mean, you're.
Why not try that? What would happen if we tried that somewhere?
Yeah, who's going to support that?
Well, what if you tried it locally, Jim?
Exactly. I mean, not literally eliminate the government entirely, but within one of the things I argue is that we should be humble about our ability to know what is right for everybody all the time, forever, every place in America. And if communities want to do things that we think, and there have to be, you can't allow people to have slavery. We had a civil war over that. I mean, there should be some limits on it, but within a very, very, very broad gauge, what I argue is that we should allow communities and local entities to, have the right to change laws in the way that they see fit. I think that if you unduly restrict the right of states, counties, cities, localities, towns, and so on, to do things that don't seem like what I would necessarily want to do, we lose the ability for society to learn through trial and error.
Now, but going back to your point on education, however, you make a lively and robust case for charter schools, but attached to that, you would favor a system of nationalized tests, would you not?
Yes. I mean, I think that in many ways this is sort of like weights and measures regulation. In other words, we require that someone selling peas at a supermarket have certain pieces of information about what's in that can. And we don't just say, well, the market will sort out. If some people want to put the ingredients on it and others don't, then people will decide what they want and so on. There is normal weights and measures legislation in every market. And in my view, we would actually facilitate the development of a market by demanding that kind of information, sort of like the SEC does, is another analogy. The SEC does when they demand that companies produce annual reports using generally accepted accounting principles. I guess
the objection to that then would be the weight of peas does not have a doctrine attached to it. In other words, it's one thing, and usually the argument goes, well, 2 + 2 is 4 in all 50 states of the Union. But the way we want our kids to learn about what America is, for example, or the sort of literature we want them to read and be tested upon, that's where things get sticky. And it gets a little bit more difficult to make more of an objective case there. And that's where politics come in, right?
Sure. And, the problem of politics is eternal. But in a world of choices, would I rather go about trying to select a school for my kids where I have a known standardized test with a known list of questions and have results that the students have achieved in different schools? Would I rather have that or not have it? It certainly is not going to give me a complete understanding of the school, and as long as I'm not the only person designing the test, it won't be exactly the test I wanted. But my argument is, much like there are eternal arguments about how net income ought to be defined in an income statement, there will be eternal arguments about that, but I'd still rather make investments in the presence of the information rather than without it.
Right. You also talk about immigration in the book, which I think you make a very good point here, a very interesting point, one that's going to, I hope, spark some discussion. Treat immigration as recruiting. What does that mean?
Well, I mean, one of the things, as you get into the debates exactly of the type we're having, where in my view there's this eternal tension between all the trial and error and disruption required for innovation and growth on one hand and the need for some kind of social cohesion on the other. One of the things I argue in the book is we need to find ways of ameliorating that. And one of the ways to do that is to improve the human capital of our society. And when you start to take that lens, that an important goal of our political economy ought to be improving our human capital, it seems just incredibly profligate that we say, well, sure, we decide who's going to move to the United States by, who happens to be related to someone who moved here in the last couple of years or whatever. And then instead, we ought to take the point of view that says, this is recruiting. This isn't charity for the rest of the world.
Right. When we get back from the break, I'd like to follow up on that a little bit. You're listening to Gadfly Radio with Ben Boychuk, Montelongo. We'll be right back.
How old is the roof on your home? If it's over